What if I told you that some of the most shocking events in history didn't happen the way you were taught? What if the official stories were just that, stories designed to hide a much darker, more complex truth? Today, we're pulling back the curtain on history's best-kept secrets. We're diving deep into events that were deliberately buried, manipulated, or completely erased from our collective memory. Get ready, because what you're about to hear might just change the way you see the world. Let's start our journey in 1918, a year the world remembers for the end of the Great War. But another, far deadlier catastrophe was sweeping the globe: the Spanish flu. We've all heard of it. But do you know why it's called the Spanish flu? It wasn't because it started in Spain. In fact, scientists now believe it likely originated in the United States at a military base in Kansas. So, why the misnomer? During World War I, countries like the US, Britain, France, and Germany were engaged in total war. Admitting that a devastating plague was tearing through their troops and civilian populations would have been seen as a sign of weakness. It would have destroyed morale and given the enemy a strategic advantage. So they did what any wartime government would do: they censored it. Newspapers were forbidden from reporting on the outbreak. It was a total media blackout. Spain, however, was neutral in the war. Their press was free, and they reported openly and honestly about the illness ravaging their country, including the fact that their own king, Alfonso XIII, had fallen gravely ill. Because they were the only ones talking about it, the pandemic became unfairly associated with them. The name Spanish flu stuck, effectively covering up the true origins and the complicity of other world powers in hiding the pandemic's severity for political gain. Imagine millions were dying and governments were more concerned with wartime propaganda than public health. It's a chilling reminder of how easily truth can become a casualty of war. Now, let's fast forward a few decades to the Cold War, a time of paranoia, espionage, and secrets. In the United States, the CIA was willing to do anything to get an edge over the Soviet Union, and anything included some truly disturbing experiments on its own citizens. This brings us to Project MKUltra. Officially, MKUltra was a top-secret research program into mind control. Unofficially, it was a nightmare. From the 1950s to the 1970s, the CIA conducted thousands of experiments, often on unwitting American and Canadian citizens. They used everything from hypnosis and sensory deprivation to electroshock, and most famously, psychoactive drugs like LSD. The goal? To see if they could break down the human mind and reprogram it. Picture this. You go to a hospital for a minor ailment, and without your knowledge, you're given a powerful hallucinogen as part of a secret government experiment. This actually happened. The CIA dosed people in hospitals, universities, and even prisons, just to observe the effects. One of the most tragic cases was that of Frank Olson, a U.S. Army biochemist who was secretly given LSD by his CIA supervisor. Days later, suffering from severe paranoia and a nervous breakdown, Olson fell to his death from a New York hotel window. His death was ruled a suicide for decades. The whole project operated in the shadows. There were no consent forms, no ethical oversight. It was a rogue operation of the highest order, so how do we know about it? In 1973, in the wake of the Watergate scandal, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered all MKUltra files destroyed. He almost succeeded. But a clerical error saved about 20,000 documents from the shredder. These surviving files, uncovered by a congressional investigation, gave the world its first horrifying glimpse into the program. MKUltra remains one of the most shocking examples of a government betraying the trust of its people, a dark chapter that was almost completely erased from history. But governments aren't the only ones who cover things up. Sometimes the truth is buried by nature itself, only to be rediscovered centuries later. Let's travel back to ancient Rome to the year 79 AD. We all know the story of Pompeii, the city frozen in time by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, but what about its sister city, Herculaneum? Herculaneum was a wealthier, smaller coastal town, and its fate was, in some ways, even more dramatic. While Pompeii was slowly buried under a thick blanket of ash and pumice, Herculaneum was hit by something far more destructive: a pyroclastic flow. This is a superheated avalanche of gas, ash, and rock, moving at hundreds of miles per hour with temperatures soaring over 500 degrees Celsius. It carbonized organic material in an instant. For centuries, historians believed that, unlike the people of Pompeii, the residents of Herculaneum had managed to escape. Excavations found empty streets and houses, leading to the assumption that they had seen the warning signs and fled by sea. It was a comforting thought, a small silver lining in a terrible disaster, but it was wrong. The twist came in the 1980s. Archaeologists were excavating the ancient shoreline when they made a ghastly discovery. Huddled inside stone boathouses, they found the skeletal remains of over 300 people. These were the residents who had run to the beach, hoping to be rescued by sea. They were waiting, packed together in the dark, when the pyroclastic surge hit. It was an instant thermal shock. They didn't suffocate on ash like in Pompeii. Their very flesh and blood were vaporized. The discovery completely rewrote the story of Herculaneum. It was not a tale of successful evacuation, but one of a terrifying, last-ditch effort that ended in tragedy. The empty streets weren't a sign of escape, but the eerie silence after a desperate flight to the shore. The truth of Herculaneum was buried not by a conspiracy, but by 60 feet of volcanic rock, waiting nearly 2,000 years to be uncovered. Our final story takes us to the vast, frozen landscape of Siberia in 1908. On the morning of June 30th, the remote Tunguska region was rocked by an explosion of unimaginable power. It flattened over 2,000 square kilometers of forest, an area larger than modern-day London. The blast was estimated to be 1,000 times more powerful than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. It registered on seismic stations across Europe and lit up the night sky as far away as Asia and America for days. But here's the strange part. When the first scientific expedition finally reached the isolated site nearly 2 decades later, in 1927, they found no impact crater. There were millions of scorched, felled trees, all pointing away from a central epicenter, but no fragments of a meteorite, no hole in the ground. What could cause such a massive explosion without leaving a crater? For years, the official explanation from the Soviet government was vague, simply attributing it to a meteorite. But the lack of evidence fueled decades of speculation and cover-ups. Theories ranged from a black hole passing through the Earth to an experiment by Nikola Tesla gone wrong, or even the crash of an alien spaceship. The Soviet authorities, deeply suspicious of outside interest and keen on controlling the narrative, restricted access to the site and classified much of the research. It wasn't until the fall of the Soviet Union that information became more freely available. The modern scientific consensus is that the Tunguska event was most likely caused by the airburst of a large meteoroid or comet. It exploded in the atmosphere about 5 to 10 kilometers above the surface. The shockwave from this aerial explosion is what flattened the forest, which explains the lack of a crater. But the decades of secrecy and misinformation created a vacuum that was filled with mystery and conspiracy. The Tunguska event became a legend, a symbol of the unknown. It serves as a powerful example of how a lack of transparency, even if unintentional at first, can obscure the truth and allow fantastical theories to take root, turning a natural phenomenon into a historical enigma. From the censorship of a global pandemic and a government's dark experiments on its own people, to the lost stories of ancient victims and the mystery of a cosmic explosion, history is filled with shadows and secrets. These events remind us that the official narrative is often just one version of the truth, and that we must always be willing to dig deeper, ask questions, and challenge what we think we know. The past is never truly dead. It's just waiting to be rediscovered. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey into the hidden corners of history. If you found these stories as fascinating as I do, please hit that like button and subscribe for more subjects that weren't in your textbooks. Let me know in the comments which historical cover-up you find most shocking. Until next time, stay curious,